Welcome. I'm Frank Conkling with Panic Consulting, and this is the Panic Consulting ArcGIS workshop. This time, what we're going to do is we're going to look at taking CAD files and bringing them and converting them into a parcel fabric. Previously, we've gone and shown you how you can take a CAD file and take a subdivision and actually pull it in and basically use those lines and points to go and build a subdivision in an existing parcel fabric. And this time what we're going to do instead is we're going to go and actually take an entire CAD file of an entire county and do the migration of that into a parcel fabric. Now this, just to let you know, this is a small county, small CAD file, and we're not going to go and convert every single layer. We're going to, however, convert one parcel type, and we'll show you the process, and you can go and use that however you want. Before we start, I just want to remind you to, if you've got any questions or anything, to go out to our website, panicconsulting.com, and on there you'll see all sorts of important information, mostly about parcels and parcel fabrics, since that's what we focus on. If you look at the events page, it will give you, on the events page, it will give you a calendar of what's coming up on here. Towards the end of the year, it gets a little slow, but you will see upcoming workshops that are available. And another way to look at this is go to the workshops and events, and that will give you a listing of what we have that's upcoming, and also things that we've done previously. So if you want, you can go back to all of the old webinars that we did and actually look at the recordings and download them if you want. And then finally, the other option is to go to our YouTube channel here, and it will take you to the YouTube channel, and all of the recordings are there. You can go and look at that. When you go to these channels, be aware that, thank you, I don't want to do that. Thank you, that there's always this show more, and we have gone and attempted recently to go and start indexing them a lot more so that you can actually find where specifically what you're looking for, and you can go and you can see where we're indexing them. This isn't every video that we've have up there, but we're working through it and trying to get it so that we can do as much of them as possible. All right, just a reminder for those of you that are here live, please ask any questions. Chris is actually moderating the chat window, so if you put them up in the chat window, Chris will make sure that my attention is brought over to them and we take care of them. And like I said, any other questions, go ahead and do that. Also, if you have any additional topics that you'd like for us to cover, please go ahead and send me an email. One more thing on here, just to go over. If you look at our events page, you will see that today is CAD files to the parcel fabric, and on December 16th, in 2 weeks, we're actually going to have the old ArcMap parcel fabric question session. So we're going to have a workshop which is focused on the older technologies, and we'll be able to answer any questions that you have about the ArcMap parcel fabric, including questions about, well, what do you have to what do you have to pay attention to when you're going and migrating it into the newer technologies? How do you go and repair some of these things? That sort of thing. So we'll be going over that in 2 weeks. Please send me other questions, or if you've got some specific thing you want me to talk about or go over, send me the data set. We'll go over it and we'll see if we can help you along with that. All right, so now let's go over the process of CAD files and bringing them into the parcel fabric. And there's actually about a dozen steps that we want to make sure we take care of. Things such as, with a CAD file, let's make sure that we check the spatial reference. and then make sure we look at the layering schema for the lines, layering schema for the annotation or points in there. Then we're going to go run through a process using feature to polygons, in which we create polygons out of those CAD files. And then we go in and we'll create a feature data set, create a parcel fabric, go in and modify and add attribution if we have additional attribution on there. Then we will append the polygons into this new parcel type. Then we'll go and we'll create records, build the parcel fabric, and then select those created lines and then split them into COGO lines. And then finally, we'll create a record to test this and actually test the parcel fabric on there. Simple, right? Well, let's get in here and start looking at it. So what I've got here is I've got a CAD file that this is the original CAD file here, and I've just drug it into a map frame in ArcGIS Pro. And when I bring it in, the first thing you want to do is you want to go and check and see what's the spatial reference on here. Does this thing have any sort of projection information on it? And if I look at the layers in here, and it assumes that in fact this is Web Mercator, which means it's defaulted and there's nothing on this CAD file. So we cannot and should not go and project it with that. We should actually have it on the original projection system that was on here. However, usually with data inside of ArcGIS Pro, there is in fact some sort of information about the spatial reference that's on here. And it's usually stored inside the geodatabase, or it's stored as a file inside the shapefile. With CAD files, it is different as far as where it's stored and how it's stored. Within a CAD file, in order to set the spatial reference, we don't use the define projection or any of those other tools in here. Instead, what we'll do is we'll right-click on it, go to properties, and on there will be a spatial reference element on here. And we will go and actually set this spatial reference. So the way we'll do that is through this validate position command over on the left pane, the left side of the properties area, in which we can go in and say, assign a coordinate system to this projection or to this CAD file. And then we can actually go in here and say, well, let's import it. In this case, I know what this is. And I can go to CAD files and I can say, well, it's actually the same as this thing right here. All right, and it will go and then set it. And then when I go and put it in there and assign it, it will go and assume that projection information on here. In order to be able to go and have it updated inside of the map document, we then actually have to go and reset that map document for this new one, because when you go and first drag a data set, whether it's a CAD file or a shape file or any sort of GIS data set into a map, it automatically assumes the projection of the first layer that gets brought in there. So since this CAD file was already put in, it had nothing, it assumed a default. So we're going to have to go and create a new map and put it in there. So I'll let this finish before we move any further. Actually, I'll cancel it. We don't need to do this. I've already got it set up on another map. All right, any questions on that? It is a little different than when we're working with standard GIS files. Instead, we are working with this CAD file. One of the things you will note is that the CAD files tend to be a little bit slower. This is an entire county, by the way. They tend to be a little bit slower for the display. And this is an entire data set. It is a real data. I'm not using a small subset on it. I'm using the entire data set here. And I'm waiting for it to go and load. Probably should have had this preloaded. All right.
Hi, Frank.
Yes.
Hi, in the meantime, I did have a question. Maybe I'll just go ahead and ask it.
Perfect timing. I'm wondering why this is taking so long. So perfect timing.
I'm just wondering, so if you have a CAD file that you maybe drag into a brand new map and it shows an unknown coordinate system in there and you don't know exactly what coordinate system came with that file, how do you go about it? Like I imagine that maybe that's not best practice, like what you just showed, going through the properties panel through catalog and assigning the projection to the whole thing before you drag it in seems like best practice. But what do you do if you don't know the coordinate system?
So that's a really good question, by the way. And by the way, I'm going to go in and do something here. I think I might be having a cloud storage issue here. So first of all, congratulations on your GISP. All right.
Thank you.
Yeah. So trying to figure out what the actual coordinate system in here is often hit or miss. If you know what county it's in and you know that the engineering company or the surveying company has done a lot of work in that, the first assumption is always, well, let's see if in fact this is the same coordinate system as the rest of the data in that county. I'm sorry, I'm going to go and close this down. That's the first thing I would do is I would check to see whether that's the actual coordinate system in there. If you're lucky, it is, and you can just go and assign that to the data and utilize that, and it should come up correctly. However, that's not always the case. Sometimes they have an assumed coordinate system. Sometimes they have an offset of some sort. All right. All right, here we go. It's at least showing me this. So what I've done is it becomes hit and miss. All right. Mm-hmm. The best thing to do is to see if you can find, first of all, if you can't, if it's not the commonly used coordinate system, I would reach out and contact that firm and say, so what is it that you did use on here? And because it's going to be problematic. Otherwise, it will be hit and miss. I can tell you that on this CAD file, they didn't know what it was. Because they had always used it. This was the only coordinate system they were using, so they were just completely unaware. I actually had to sort of figure out, okay, so where are they at? What county is this? What's the coordinate system that's used often? And I actually wound up having an option of 3 different coordinate systems that were being used in this area, depending upon whether it was, NAT 83 or whatever. I actually had to test it and then use Esri's base maps and put the base maps behind it to see whether or not it overlaid the base maps correctly. And it was the third one, of course, the last one, it actually overlaid correctly. And I was able to then go and assign it to that spatial reference. But often with CAD files, because they're used to working in their own coordinate space, it's difficult to figure out. So, and it is hit and miss. I wish I could tell you there was a more systematic way to do it, but those are the steps that I do. Check and see with the county what they're using, check and see with the firm what they're using. And then other than that, you then have to start sort of minimizing it and figuring out exactly what's being used there. All right.
Okay, thank
Good
you.
question. Thank you, Heather. All right. So what I've done is I now have these loaded. And in fact, if I look at the coordinate system, it is State Plane, New Mexico West on here. And these are the actual coordinate system, or these are the actual CAD files. Really what you're going to use is only two of the elements, two of the geometry types in there. You're going to use annotation for the labels, and you're going to use those labels as annotation for when you're building this polygon. And then you're going to use the lines themselves. Often you will find that polygon groups are most CAD files don't represent polygons for the same reasons that we as GIS people use it. So you can probably not use that. Multi-patch, there might be some multi-patch figures in there. You're not going to be using that, and you're not going to be using the point. So it's mostly going to be annotation and polyline. And when you bring this in, what you're going to see is that it now goes and automatically goes and displays all of the layers as specific individual discrete layers, all under a group layer on there. So the next challenge is finding, well, what is the layer that I want to go and display here? And that is also a challenge. In this case, I'm going to look in here and I'm going to go and select an individual line here. That line, I believe, represents a parcel boundary. And I'm going to look and see that it is on a layer of UCLID_parcel. Now I have two options here. I can go and tell it to turn off every one of those parcels, or I can go in here and set my overall, let me see here. I think I can, no, I guess I can't do that. So I'm going to have to go in and just turn all of these off, the ones that I don't want. All right. And I did a control click to go and turn them all off. And then I turned on just that one layer. And I think that this is a good layer. This is everything in here. And I'm going to do the same thing with annotation. So I'm going to identify actually what layers are available. And I'm going to control click on here and turn off everything except for temp. I believe it's UPC. UPC is the actual points that I'm going to be using. So those are the actual label points for these individual elements in here that I'm going to be migrating over on here. So that's the next big step. First step is identifying spatial reference. Then it's identifying the individual layers that you really want to bring in to this. Once you've done that, now you have to go and take all of these and migrate them out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my Anno, or excuse me, back to my layer, my polyline here. And I'm going to say, for this, select all of these layers here. So I'm going to select all of these lines that are on this layer. And there's 67,000 of them, and I'm going to export them. I'm going to do an export of features. I'm going to put them over into a geodatabase. And in that geodatabase, I actually have converted data in here. And this is a data set. So there's a location. I'm going to look just to make sure that I don't rename this the wrong thing. And I have parcel lines. I'm going to call this temp lines. All right. I'm just going to tell it to go ahead and write that thing out. Because all I want is a geometry on here. And you're going to find it going and exporting them out. So the question is, well, why didn't I just go and export everything out? Because I did not have a query against that so that I only chose those lines. So that's the first thing I'm going to do. So I'm going to export out the lines on here. Then I'm going to go and I'm going to go in here and I'm going to go to my labels and I'm going to go and export that out also. Again, I'm going to go to my converted data and I'm going to call that temp labels on here. And just to let you know, one of the things that I prefer to do is to take it out of the CAD format into the GIS format. Let's go and refresh this and see there's the two on here. All right, so now I can go and go back here and turn off those CAD layers. Get rid of those. Matter of fact, we can get rid of this now, and we can get rid of this GIS data on here. One of the things you'll find as you're moving through is that CAD files tend to be very, very slow in drawing. And one of the reasons for that is that they really have no spatial indexing on there, which we've enjoyed inside of GIS data for almost 30 years now. And it allows it to draw much faster because it only draws the area inside our display area. All right, let's go in here now and let's symbolize this just so we can see what's in here. And we're going to symbolize this. And we're going to go to properties and see. Let's just make that a point. And here so we can actually see where these points are. Now, one of the things I see is that there's multiple points in here. All right. There's multiple points in here, and there should have been some lines in here. So we've got cleanup to do eventually. I'm not going to do it on this workshop, but we have cleanup to do eventually on here because there's more than one label inside each of what will be these polygons formed by these clotheslines. And it may be that there's the CAD file itself had some issues and it wasn't all on one individual layer. It might have been on multiple layers in there. But again, as for purposes of this workshop, we're not going to deal with cleaning up the data before we bring it in here. All right. So we now have the lines and the points that we're going to go and use to create this. Next thing we need to do is we need to go and use a geoprocessing tool. We're going to go to analysis, tools, have it bring up the geoprocessing tool, and we're going to use feature to Polygon. All right, this feature to Polygon tool, what it will do is it will allow us to go and take the line features and also identify the point features and use those as the elements that are used to convert. So let's go in here and let's call this temp polygons. So it will allow us to use the lines as the exterior geometry, and it will use the points for the attribution. And I'm going to say, go ahead and run this and let it go and run. Now, one of the things we didn't do is we didn't go to check to see whether or not this had densified curves on it or anything. We're not going to do that as part of this workshop. We've included that in other workshops, but we now have these polygons all created. When I go to edit and actually select something and look at my attribution on here, I will see that what I have is I have a text field called, which contains the actual value of that label that was created. because I told it to go and bring all of the attribution in. It took all the elements of the annotation from the CAD file, but that's all right. We're going to be okay with that. All right. So we now have created polygons on here, which we're comfortable with and we're going to be using on them. The next step is to go and create a new feature data set. And I'm going to delete this one, just go in and show you. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in here and say, create a new feature data set. And that feature data set, I'm going to call it temp Parcel Fabric. I'm going to spell that correctly. And then I'm going to use the projection information that I have and tell it to go and assign that. I want to make sure it has the same projection information in there. And invalid characters. And it does have invalid characters. Sorry about that. That was not very good. Parcel Fabric. Spell it correctly. Go and let's see if I can pull this down. And the current map, there it is there. Make sure that's spelled correctly. All right, so I now have this new feature data set. It's got nothing in it right now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go and tell it to create a new Parcel Fabric. All right, and we're just going to call that Parcel Fabric, tell it to create it. Now this is ArcGIS Pro 2.9. It's going to create a version 5 Parcel Fabric. So one thing you want to be aware of is what version of Parcel Fabric you're going to be creating. And if you're dealing with just file geodatabases, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference. However, if you're going to do an enterprise implementation, you want to recognize that the versions of Parcel Fabric must match the release of your enterprise server in order for it to work correctly. So in this case, version 5 of the Parcel Fabric works with ArcGIS Enterprise 10.9.1. Version 4 of the Parcel Fabric works with 10.8.1, I believe it is. And it goes backwards. There is some documentation for that if you're looking for it. So once I've done with that, what this actually does is it creates a standard Parcel Fabric. And if we look at the properties of that Parcel Fabric, it will tell us generally that here's the Parcel Fabric. It is a release 5. The compatible pro versions are 2.9. So you use 2.9 desktop to go and edit it. It was created. It did enable topology on here. The spatial reference is the same spatial reference as my feature data set. And feature classes right now, the only feature classes it has are the standard Parcel Fabric feature classes: records, connections, points, adjustment points, lines, and adjustment vectors on here. It does not have any parcel types that we can load in. So the first thing we want to do is we want to go and define. Well, we're going to include a certain type of parcels in here. So I'm going to go in here to manage and say add a parcel type. All right, and from that will give me my Parcel Fabric I'm working in, and I can say tax parcels. All right. By the way, this option here is for administrative boundaries that's used when you're going and creating a parcel type that is a large parcel type, sort of like zoning or land use, those sorts of things. And it has an impact as far as whether or not it's included in all the topologies that are in here. I just went and told it to add a new parcel type. It's going to create 2 new feature classes. It's going to create tax parcels and the tax parcels lines on here. It will also go and add those values to the Parcel Fabric topology. It will, let's see what's actually on here. So now you'll see it has tax parcels lines are in here also. So it's added them to there. If I look at my topology, it also goes and adds them. There's my standard ones. And here on the bottom, they are added to the topology on here. All right. So I have created an empty parcel fabric. I now want to make sure that I can start utilizing it. So I'm going to go and take and add this and tell it to add it to a new map. It's going to bring the parcel fabric in with the standard symbology on here. And you will also notice what it did is it grouped these feature classes together, and that all the parcel types, each parcel type has its own group layer. That group layer consists of current lines and current polygons and historic lines and historic polygons. On the current lines and polygons, there is a definition query that says the retired by record is null. It has no value in it. Same thing with the polygon here. It says retired record is null, but the historic says that the retired value, retired by record, is not null, meaning it has some value in there. That's how it defines whether something is current or historic, is whether or not the retired by record attribute field has any values in it. All right. So when I look at this, I'm going to go to my data design and determine here are the standard attribute fields that are required and part of the standard parcel fabric schema. You have object IDs, you have global IDs, a shape field, a name field, a created by record, retired by record, stated area units, calculated area, misclosure ratio, misclosure distance. Those have to do with COGO and whether or not it's closed, whether it's a seed or not, and then editor tracking, shape length, shape area, and validation status. By the way, the validation status has to do with attribute rules, validate attribute rules, whether or not it's been validated, whether it's dirty or not. We're not going to make any change here other than calling this the UCLID on here. And we're going to make sure that that is, in fact, turned on and highlighted. All right. By the way, this is one of the nicest parts of ArcGIS Pro, is the ability to go and make changes to the schema, highlight things, configure things inside the data designer. All right, I've got an empty thing here. I have got, if I look at the attribute table, here's the value here on here. There's no records in here. So the next thing I have to do is, if I look at this, I've gone through, I've checked the spatial reference. I've gone through and looked at the layering structures. I've created a feature to polygons with the label option to go and create a polygon, created a data set, created the parcel fabric, and I made any modifications to attributes I needed on here. So I've gone through those steps. What I want to do now is all the elements inside the parcel fabric. I want to go and append the polygons, and then I want to go and create records and build the parcel fabric. So what I want to do now is, and I can do this a couple different ways. I'm going to use the geoprocessing tool. I'm going to put it over here. I'm going to use the append geoprocessing tool. Append data. By the way, this append data is the same thing as if I went in here and I right-clicked and I said load data. It actually loads up the same data set for me. So then the question is, well, I want to go and move the temp polygons into the tax records feature class. I also, it gives me the option to determine whether or not I want to go and do a query against it. It's nice. It's not, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to load every polygon in there. And then the next thing I want to do is I want to go and tell it whether or not it should match anything, or whether I should use a field map to reconcile it. So I can use a field map and say that the name field, I want to go and take and use the text value. And by the way, this is one of those little interface idiosyncrasies that catches me every time I do this. You have to remember, once you go and tell it that, to add that. All right, so that's going to be the value that's stored in a text field is going to become the value that's stored in a name field. That's the only thing I'm going to do here. I'm not going to do anything else here. Just going to say, go ahead and run the append. And we can see that it now has appended all of those values in here. If we open this up, we can see here's all of those values that are stored in here. And we actually have 15,790 of them. They all have been assigned their own unique global ID. They have not been assigned anything about records or anything of that sort. On here, they do not have any areas calculated on here. They have nothing else other than that. This one, I want to be sure that you're aware of that, is as soon as I built that parcel fabric, it turned on editor tracking. So it now is tracking everything I do. So every calculation I do is going to be tracked in here. You're going to be probably going and creating this for yourself, so it's not as much of a concern. But if you don't want this to populate, you want to make sure that you use the geoprocessing tool to, let's go ahead and here, the geoprocessing tool of disable editor tracking first, and you tell what data set, and it will turn editor tracking off. And again, do that right after you go and create that parcel fabric. And then once you've got everything loaded, you've got everything calculated and set the way you want, re-enable it, because it has to have editor tracking turned on for the parcel fabric. All right, so it's got editor tracking on here. What did I say my next step was after I appended them? Create the records. So if I look at the parcel fabric here, what is a record? Here's the attribute table. A record is a polygon that's used to organize everything. And it allows me to go and say that this polygon and these lines were used to build this record. It's a way to keep track of transactions. And in order to work with something, or a better way to explain this, is if I go to my parcel fabric, they've actually moved this now. If I go here to an attribute rule, there's now an attribute rule that says that in order for something to be considered a real parcel, it has to have records associated with the lines and the polygons. So the first thing I want to do is I want to create a record for every one of these polygons. And once I do that, you'll see the reasoning and the purpose of that. So I'm going to go in here. I'm going to say build, excuse me, let's say create records. create parcel records. I'm going to tell it to create records for my tax parcel polygons. And I have an option. I can either tell it to use a field, or I can tell it to write an expression. Now, when I'm going and building this, I might want to put information on here. For example, I might want to say, this was the original migrated data, in which case I would use an expression and do something like, and this is arcade, by the way, migrated. And then maybe I put the, where are we? Put the username in, or not the username, the actual parcel polygon name on there, so that now these records that are created will represent and say, this was the original data. Yeah, so I could call that migrated, I could call that original or whatever, and I can say, go ahead and create these individual polygons. Chris, everybody seems to be really quiet. I don't know whether I'm going too fast or what.
Yeah, we don't have anything in chat.
Yeah. So what it's actually doing is just going through and evaluating every single polygon, finding out if there's uniqueness, whether it has more than one is created with it. And it's creating a polygon that represents the envelope of those polygons on here. So if I go in here and say, turn on these records, I'm going to turn these off here. Go in here and see, it will say that this was migrated. This was migrated, and here's the limit of that parcel that's being migrated on here. So it's a way for me to go and say, okay, now show me everything that was associated with that one record when it started. So that record is a way now to organize all the information, all the features that are associated with those individual parcels. Now, what you're finding right now is that if we look, we have parcel polygons, but we don't have any lines in here. We don't have any lines in here. And if we look, we don't have any points in here. No points on here, because they are created with the Parcel Fabric when we tell it to build the records. So now that I have records, I can tell it to go ahead and build every single one of these parcels from the records and make sure that it has all the required lines and all the required points on here as part of it. So Chris, you said that there is a question. What's the best way to change the record for a parcel at a later date? For example, what if we wanted to change the record to migrated to Anderson's edition? Really good question here. So thank you, Mark. So this is, in fact, the records are really nothing more than simple feature classes. Now, on the simple feature classes, by the way, I've got one here that there was no unique ID. They had no label point inside of it. So I can just show you that right now, I can go in here and edit this, and I can call this Anderson's Edition, if I spell correctly. All right. So now if I go here and say, go ahead and zoom to Anderson's Edition. Oh, there's multiple ones in there that had none in there. So I can tell it to go and select that on here. Looks like there's a whole bunch of them. So anyway, it is the actual name on the record really is a secondary attribute. It's not the primary attribute. The actual primary attribute on a record is, in fact, the object ID, the global ID of that record. That's the primary key. That's the one that's more problematic to change. You really should not ever really try to change it. But the name attribute on a record, really, you can change that anytime you want. It doesn't have any impact on it. It is a secondary. By the way, while we're here, we can look at this here. Part of the record is whether or not how many individual parcels are associated with that record. And we can see there's 29 because we had 29 different polygons that didn't have any labels on them when we did this conversion. So we'd have to go back and clean that up later. But optimally, you're going to have, and it depends upon whether you have multi-part polygons or not, you should have like one record for each parcel when you do the initial migration on here. Good question mark. So I now have records, but again, I have no lines, I have no polygon, or I have no lines, I have no points. I do have polygons, but that's it. So what do I do next? I know that I have more than 1,000 parcels, so I can tell it to go and build the Parcel Fabric on here. And I can tell it to build this Parcel Fabric. And I actually have an extent. I could tell it to build just the default, which is the entire Parcel Fabric. I can tell it to do the intersection of individual inputs, the current display. I could specify it. I could browse it. I could tell it to just whichever one. Default says build the entire data set. Check every single record that's in here and build it. So I'm going to tell it to go ahead and run this. Now, what this will do is if you watch down here, it will say the first thing it's going to do is every single record, it's going to go around to it and see, does it have lines? It will create the lines, create any missing lines inside for each of the records. It will then go and check and see, does it have points at the ends of every one of these? It will go and create those also. All right, so this is going to take a little while to go and do this. Do we have any other questions on here on this? I know Heather's asking, what's the best way to get multiple attributes associated with the parcels from the original CAD? A name field as well as a record name that could be used to create records later on. It was when I did the create records, I actually told it an arcade expression. Right? And I will do this often when I'm going and creating and migrating a Parcel Fabric. For example, lots inside of a subdivision. Oftentimes what you'll have is you'll have a lot polygon, and you might have 1,000 polygons that have lot number 1 on them. So what you want is more than just the lot number 1 on it. You want to go and actually make sure that it has everything in there that it needs. So you're going to want either an object ID, or you're going to want the subdivision in which this is located. So you use that expression to go and build the record identifier, the record name, when you go and do that. So then you can do searches later and say, hey, show me this individual record on here. And I hope that went and actually answered your question. All right, so now when I zoom in on here, I see that, in fact, I have not just polygons, but I also have lines, and I also have points for every single one of these parcels. And to say it in a more succinct way, I make sure that I have polygons, lines, and points for every record on here. So now I have what could be considered a complete Parcel Fabric. However, completeness is not always the best thing you want on here. For example, I have 65,000 line feature classes. And if I go to any one of these, just to go and zoom to it, all right, in this case, this is one line. I'm going to try and find a different one. something that might be a little bit more problematic on here. Of course, it didn't show me all that. All right, so let's do this. Let's go and if you look at my, if you look at the sort of outline, what I said is I would then create I would select the created lines and split them into COGO lines. Let's assume that they're already split into COGO lines. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go and use a modify tool to go and calculate or update the COGO values on all of the lines that I have created and let it go and update the COGO for me. And as we go through, this might take a little bit of time in here, but yeah, so Heather, that the conversion, you want to make sure that the one critical point you have there is when you go and create the record labels, the records on here, you want to make sure that you're not creating records that are associated with multi-part features. For example, every single lot number 1 in every single subdivision inside that county on there. You want to have uniqueness if you can create it. For a couple reasons. One, it's going to help you long-term with spatial indexing. It's going to help you with going and identifying specific elements in here. So there might be some special processing you have to do, to the point where you may actually have to go and create a new attribute field and call it record name. I know this is one of the things that ESRI does a lot, and that if they want the record name to be a specific thing, they'll create an attribute field in the Polygon feature class and do some manipulation so that it actually will get stored in it the values that they want to use for the record names. Because I'm comfortable with Arcade, I'll tend to just do that on my own on the fly when I'm going and building it. Again, as Mark pointed out, there's no real problem going back later and modifying the names of the records. The key attribute of the records is the global ID. That's the one that all other values are related to. So the name of the record is a minor attribute inside of there. All right. Good. So let's let this update the COGO. Again, this is going to go and update all values in here, and it's going to make sure that it just overwrites everything and updates all of them. And we'll go in and make sure that this is done here. We'll go and view this a little bit more and show you some of the elements inside the line feature class on here. Again, as you can tell, I'm not afraid to go and do everything in here at one time instead of just a select set. While this is doing this, again, this is just basically to update the COGO value. So there's some sort of value on here. It becomes a little bit more complicated if you had, for example, dimensions that you want to capture those dimensions. That's a whole nother workshop on here. And then the only thing left to do now is to go and create a new record and test the Parcel Fabric to see whether or not it gives you any values in here. So let's go in here, let's zoom in. Let's clear this out. And in fact, we now have COGO values on everything. Let me go and show you. I'm going over to the list by labeling and showing you that we now have 3 in 2.9. We now have 3 labels for here. They all are going and inputting out the bearing and the distance. If you wish to go and have it just show you the distance and not the bearing and the distance, there is a setting in here called show direction. If you go in here and set this to false, all right, and that's one, go in here and you set this show direction to false here and apply that. And then finally, go to this one and set this to false here. It will go and do that. This, by the way, is problematic for me, and that, and you can see it here, it's spaced differently. I actually go into each of these label expressions to the very bottom. If I'm not displaying the direction, I will go and remove where it's actually displaying the direction to make sure you can see that I put it now is actually being correctly placed on here. And for this final one here, that's at the very bottom. All right, any questions yet? We've got a couple minutes here, so let's real quickly go in here and create a parcel. So let's go and test this. We're going to create a record, and we're just going to use that default setting on here. And we're now going to go and create a parcel lines. And let's do it correctly. Let's go and use a traverse tool. All right, and we're going to use lines, and we're going to start here, and we're going to go north for 50 feet. We're going to go east for 50 feet. We're going to go south for 50 feet, and we're going to go west for 50 feet. And we have now created all the lines here. For our traverse, we're going to tell it to create a seed. You can now see the seed, and we're going to tell it to build it. It's gone and built it, and it now created points for us. And finally, we're going to tell it to clip it out of the parcel underneath it. And it's going to clip it. And we now have, there's the overall parcel, and there's the smaller new parcel that we've just created. So in that 1 hour, we took a CAD file, converted it from CAD format into GIS format. We then build polygons out of that, use those polygons to go and append into a new Parcel Fabric structure. And we've gone through and created everything we need, and we now have a Parcel Fabric structure on here. I'm going to tell you this was easy because there were there was no complexity built into it. But when you start to go and build, for example, lot polygons or PLSS polygons, you just want to be aware that there's things that can complicate this a whole lot. So let me ask, are there any questions here on here at all?
None in the chat.
None in the chat. All right. Hopefully you got something out of this. So hopefully you enjoyed it. So I'm going to stop the recording and we'll move into just open office hours. Thanks for attending, and we hope you enjoyed this workshop. If you have questions, would like some more details about anything we discussed during this workshop, or if you or anyone at your organization would like information about training, support, or ways in which we can help you with your GIS needs, please contact me at frank@pandaconsulting.com or call me at 561-691-3277, and we can discuss how we can help you with your needs.